Good day to you, Kathy Kelly.
Hello, Mansoor. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. You seldom visit Los Angeles. I'm delighted and honored to have you here, and we're going to talk with you. And you recently just came back from Afghanistan. Please elaborate on that, whatever you want to say, and then we'll get to Q&A if it comes up to.
I've been very conscious of the trauma sustained by the young people that I know who live in Afghanistan and feel a bit trapped. I suppose it's understandable that young people in Afghanistan today, knowing that there's very little chance of employment, that their education is honestly kind of substandard, that malnourishment and disease and attacks afflict people on a daily basis all throughout their country, they are finding it difficult in some ways to look forward to their own futures, or bringing children into the world, beginning new families. But they're young people, and 65% of the country is under the age of 25. Anyway, I've been most impressed by them because instead of dwelling on reasons for revenge or retaliation or disappointment or depression, they continually come up with ideas for how to seriously, pragmatically reach out and help other people that are needier than they are. So I've watched them devise a project called the Duvet Project, where they help seamstresses get the materials to make big, heavy blankets that are really the difference between life and death for people out in the refugee camps during the cold winters. And the seamstresses earn just a meager wage, but it helps them feed their children. And they call that the Duvet Project. And now they've been organizing a school, an alternative school for the children that are out on the streets, being the only breadwinners for their families. Amnesty International had said 2 years ago that as many as 400 people every day are displaced in Afghanistan by war, by fighting. Well, where do they go? They go to the big cities like Kabul. There are no jobs for whatever breadwinners might be with a family that makes this kind of move, so they send the children out. And the children shine shoes, or they sell bubble gum, or carry scales and ask people to step on the scale and weigh themselves and make just a tiny bit of money, not even close to what would adequately feed a family. So my young friends wanted to help these little children, little laborers, become literate, at least learn their alphabet, learn their times tables. So they've started a school, the Street Kids School, and it's going quite well. It's now in 9 months, and 31 children are literate, and there are about 50 more that are close to that. That gives an arrow toward what could be. But meanwhile, I think people in the United States are told falsely by the Pentagon that the United States has made things better for people in Afghanistan. It's not true. $104 billion in non-military aid was spent in Afghanistan, and the statistics are just miserable. I mean, just my own living experiences there. You get electricity maybe every other day. The sewage and sanitation is terrible. The quality of air is very, very bad. It's reputed to have had the highest content of fecal matter in its air of any place in the world. The corruption is so massive that 2 years ago, Afghanistan tied with Somalia and North Korea as the most corrupt country in the world. And meanwhile, you look at the charts of how was this money spent on counter narcotics. Well, 80 to 90% of the world's opium is coming from Afghanistan. On governance, and then you find out it's the most corrupt government in the world, or one of 3. So what did the United States do in all those years? I think we filled the pockets of weapon makers and war profiteers.
So you mentioned bubble gum, kids selling bubble gum. I remember when I was a kid, I was selling bubble gum in Iran to, we were kids, didn't know anything. But there was an infrastructure, there was production, there was a refinery, that adults had jobs. And so we were selling gums to people who had real jobs. And now in Afghanistan, are they real jobs?
Well, that's, of course, a huge problem. In terms of resources, there might be trillions of dollars of resources underneath the Hindu Kush Mountains in terms of rare earth elements, or in the Caspian Sea basin. You know, there's still designs on a Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline. But in terms of development, those jobs don't exist as yet. And even once extraction might be facilitated, it doesn't necessarily mean that Afghan people are going to get better jobs. Right now, it seems like a hope would be to rehabilitate the agricultural infrastructure in Afghanistan, replenish the flocks, reseed the orchards, clean out the irrigation systems. But of course, big companies are looking at other options, and then we should acknowledge that 80 to 90% of the world's opium is coming from Afghanistan.
I want to ask you a couple of questions, but first and foremost is what gives you hope? You've been traveling back and forth to Afghanistan, to Iraq, and I don't think we want to get into the Iraq question right now, but what gives you hope to do what you do? Because it's really a hopeless situation. 40 years of war in Afghanistan, that just depletes anybody's hope, inspiration, to just, you know, that's 2 generations.
You know, Mansour, I'm not sure I am very motivated by hope. I know that I learned in Iraq when I was in pediatrics wards where none of the children would leave alive. I knew nevertheless that there was no woman in that ward who could afford my despair. The women have other children. They would lose those little ones, but they had other children. And so I and others learned to say that we couldn't walk away from women we met in hospitals and say, well, you know, we tried to do something, but it's a tough sell in the United States. I mean, the biggest disappointment of my adult life has been that we were not able to end those economic sanctions. And now it's compounded in knowing that most people don't even remember that the economic sanctions were part of the mix in Iraq. And we're not thinking that those who are part of ISIS today might very well be the brothers or the fathers or the cousins of those little children, 500,000 children who died in Iraq under economic sanctions. Or they might have been the relatives of the people that were wrongfully imprisoned or tortured, or the people who were in the various bombing campaigns, the survivors who buried their relatives whose bodies were torn apart. I mean, the hideous bloodshed and cruelty that went on in Iraq gave rise, I believe, to the extreme ideologies that have created ISIS, or IS, Islamic State. Now, do we think that continued United States war-making and weapon profiteering and sending in joint special operations commandos and drone surveillance and aerial bombardments isn't going to create an even worse extremist ideological grouping? I mean, we keep trying to provoke big powers, the Soviet Union and, I'm sorry, the former Soviet Union, Russia and China. But, you know, as we tried to provoke the Soviet Union once upon a time. But there's no chance at the kind of détente that was looked for with regard to Gorbachev or was sought with regard to Nixon in China, with the way that the United States is playing the game of big power politics now. So in terms of hope, sure, I would hold out the possibility that negotiators and diplomats and people who actually want to solve problems could get the upper hand and take it away from the reckless kind of cowboy sorts that are running things now. But that doesn't really motivate me each day. I'm mostly motivated because I fall in love with a group of kids over in Afghanistan.
So it's really hard to have hope. I mean, just in a broad stroke, the term hope. You know, you mentioned a couple of things: corruption, and if you don't mind to talk, since you're going back and forth to Afghanistan, and you know what's going on the ground. At least you're familiar with, you feel it, what's going on with what people are telling you. Talk about, even with a new government that just was quasi imposed on Afghanistan. Talk about the corruption and corruption level and who's benefiting from the corruption.
Well, it's so widespread that almost any transaction can be subject to corruption. People can blackmail one another and use elements of fear. If you don't pay this, then I'll turn you in for that. So even on the personal, familial level, amongst the young people I know, there are some that are afraid of their families being blackmailed. But then on the more structural level, Anand Gopal, who wrote the book No Good Men Among the Living, wrote that if you trace the history of a United States base, you'll be able to get at some of the roots of exploitation and corruption. Because what happens is that people kind of sniff out who's got money. And then in order to be able to get a share in that money or in those weapons or in some kind of resources like fuel, people will approach those who have, and often I'm thinking of the US military, approach those who have these resources and say, you need protection. You need protection from those people over there who are bad people, and we can offer you that protection. And then if they haven't convinced the people that they need protection, maybe they'll attack them themselves and then say, we know who did that attack and now we'll protect you. So it's this kind of racket, protection rackets that often develop when people want to be able to get a share in the wealth that does appear in the country. Well, the United States was spending $2 billion per week on the United States military presence. In 2014, it was $2.1 million per soldier per year. That's a concentrated level of wealth. And so people in very corrupt ways tried to get a share of that. But it wasn't as though, even with the $104 billion of non-military assistance that the United States spent from 2001 until 2014 in Afghanistan, that didn't go to meeting human needs either. It got siphoned off in all of these various schemes and corrupt fraudulent plans, people saying, well, we're going to build this hospital. Well, okay, they built a state-of-the-art hospital, but everybody knew while they were building it that there was no way to fuel the hospital. Nobody could ever afford the cost of fuel for this state-of-the-art hospital. So it's just sitting there like a big white elephant, and you know, the people that got the contracts got paid, and whoever designed it got paid. These kinds of corruptions are detailed in the Special Inspector General in Afghanistan report that's submitted to Congress 4 times a year. And nobody seems to raise an eyebrow. They just think, oh, well, give some more taxpayer money to that. And then when it comes to assigning blame for things that go wrong, well, then it's those unreasonable, undereducated, violent extremists in Iraq and in Afghanistan. We never look at ourselves in the mirror.
So what you're saying is the corruption is actually starts here and it trickles down in Afghanistan.
Sure, I lay the blame at the door of Lockheed Corporation and General Electric and Boeing and other places that want to sell their products, their weapon products or their, you know, different kinds of drones. General Atomics should also be mentioned. How are they going to sell these materials if there's not a war going on?
And you mentioned drug, and I know when a society is falling apart, 2 things happen. Prostitution happens and drugs or alcohol or goes up too. So talk about the drug abusement or usage or sales.
Well, when I think about how it can be that 519,647 children under age 5 are suffering from severe acute malnourishment in Afghanistan, well, they can't eat poppy. And the farmers that want to plant a crop that will be drought resistant and that will be easier to get to market are told by the people who want to be involved in the poppy trade, yeah, we'll help you get your products to market, just plant it. And so it's difficult for farmers to kind of wean themselves off of planting poppy and maybe go for something like wheat or tomatoes. Some are doing that. In the Helmand province, there's actually been a much higher level of wheat and tomatoes harvested this year. But the temptation has certainly been over the years, since the Taliban eradicated the poppy crop in 2002, poppy has come back with more or less with a vengeance. And where does it go? Well, it gets transported to Iran, to Russia, and other countries nearby, neighboring countries, don't want this level of drugs coming into their countries. But I think here in the United States, most of the heroin comes in through Mexico. But because there's such a glut on the market, because Afghanistan's production is so high, we can presume that the price of heroin has gone down. And so it actually affects people here in the United States as well.
So for Afghanistan, what do you see the future?
It's very hard to say what will be the future for Afghanistan. We know that China would like to stabilize Pakistan and Afghanistan because it envisions having these kind of new silk routes and railways and roadways that would allow Chinese control of extraction of very precious and maybe irreplaceable resources. Well, I don't think the United States wants China to gain ascendance, and so I think there will still be competition between China and the United States, and that the United States will use Afghanistan in whatever ways it feels it wants to, and maybe try to somehow convince the U.S. public, well, we're there to protect the women and children from the Taliban. But even the most recent statistics show that 58% of the U.S. public says that the United States' role in Afghanistan has been a defeat and very, very bad for the United States.
So do you see this as the maybe the last step, the last placehold for American empire as it's declining?
I believe the United States no longer can control the violent forces that the U.S. unleashed in the Middle East because of the war and the weaponry that the United States has been in support of. I don't think the United States can control these forces. I think that there would be a role for the United Nations, a strengthened United Nations that could get beyond the manipulation by the big power elites within the Security Council. A strengthened United Nations might be able at least to convene various warring groups and say, look, if you'll lay down your weapons, this is what we can offer, and kind of big carrots, hospitals and schools and roadways and employment. But right now, that's not likely to happen as long as the major powers are using countries like Afghanistan as, and fighters within Afghanistan to fight their proxy wars. And the same, I think, is true with the Saudi government and the Iranian government fighting each other, and the United States trying to be in competition with Russia and using these various conflicts in order to provoke the competitions that the big powers are engaging in. So
as long as U.S. is involved, status quo will continue?
I think that the United States has shown an abiding contempt for negotiation and diplomacy and nonviolent resolution of problems. I think the United States, just by virtue of how many weapons we sell every year, has added to the likelihood of warfare.
So would you say Obama administration failed? Because when he came, he said he wanted to end the war in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Well, when President Obama said that he was against dumb wars, he seemed to think that the war in Iraq was a dumb war. Well, I don't know if he thinks now he's going to be starting a smart war if we end up with boots on the ground in Iraq. He seemed to think that in Afghanistan maybe there was something more redeeming about that war. But I think by allowing the generals to kind of sucker him into a surge, he made a very, very big mistake. It would have been better if he had been a one-term president, but didn't have responsibility for the lives lost and the people slain on his second watch.
You are the first person who has said that. It would have been better for him to just be a one-term president.
Oh, far better. For him, yes.
Explain.
Well, I think that in terms, I mean, he's a young man. He and his family have a life ahead of them. I think that in terms of his own claim to ethical behavior, it would have been better for him to be a one-term president. But I also think for the country to know that they were being led by somebody who said it's just not worth the price to continue to cooperate with the warmongers amongst us, and I'm going to end it, and if that means that my presidency is curtailed, so be it. He could have had a tremendous teaching capacity for a public that needed that kind of voice, that kind of witness.
I'm holding the view that he's morally bankrupt.
I was so impressed with Jimmy Carter's changes.
Yes.
The first time I was ever arrested, it was protesting Carter for reinstating draft registration. But I've certainly wanted to champion Jimmy Carter from his Habitat for Humanity days right into his willingness to stand up and say, Gaza's being attacked again, and it's an open-air prison, and the Israelis are engaging in cruel and violent and illegal behavior. I think he's been trying in a number of different world contexts to uphold human rights. So you can't predict very easily what's going to happen to a person. Archbishop Oscar Arnolfo Romero had been beatified earlier this week, and it's been a source of great joy for many people. But we those of us who would recall, know that in his earlier years he was quite conservative and didn't want to express his faith in public campaigning. But the most impoverished people converted him. And I think that could happen even with the Obamas.
So you said arrested, and that's the first time I have heard it, but I know that you were sentenced for 3 months. What do you say, in prison, jail, penitentiary? How would you define that?
Well, I was sentenced to 3 months in federal prison. And the judge listened to the military prosecutor say, "Your Honor, Miss Kelly is in great need of rehabilitation." 3 days after I got out, I came out to Beale Air Force Base and was arrested again. So I don't think I was rehabilitated in their view, although I needed to kind of rehabilitate my own remembrance of what it's like to be in prison, to be alongside women serving 15, 20 years, many of them full of remorse, separated from their children, families broken, and for what? Why should they be so overpunished?
So many people don't know you because only in circles of people who follow you and your actions, they know what happened. Could you explain what happened? You end up in court and the judge giving you 3 months sentence.
Well, everybody in the courtroom was, I looked over my shoulder and they were holding up 6 fingers saying, "Get ready for 6," because the judge was reading my record. I've been arrested many times, and this was my 4th time going into a federal
For good
prison.
deeds, not for...
Oh, I don't think I ever committed a crime that I was accused of. I mean, I did pay taxes to the U.S. government before 1986, and that was participating in a crime, but I haven't paid any federal income tax since 1986. I and another co-defendant, Georgia Walker, crossed a line at a military base where drones are being operated, and we carried a loaf of bread and we wanted to talk to the commander. We wanted to ask him, did any of your airborne drones that are weaponized kill anybody today? And how does your manual teach the pilots to tell the difference between a combatant and somebody who's not a combatant, a civilian, for instance? What do you do when pilots say, "We don't want to do this work anymore"? We had good questions, but we were arrested instead.
You didn't get any of your answers?
No.
Oh. So what happened in the court?
Well, I was trying to persuade the judge that I had exercised my First Amendment right for redress of grievance. I assembled peaceably for redress of grievance, and that was the place where the grievance is located. And the judge felt, I think, that he has a job to protect the weapons. I think he has a job to protect the Constitution. So we differ on that. But the judge found me guilty and could have given me 6 months, but he only gave 3, so that was a surprise. My co-defendant was given a year probation.
So he wanted you to get rehabilitated, which means change your mind?
I suppose the military prosecutor wanted me to change my mind, but that's why people kind of chuckled in the courtroom. That's certainly not going to change my mind. I've had a little bit of time to
It had put a
cultivate these
smile on your
ideas.
face.
Well, I was actually very pleased to be with the women that I spent those 3 months with.
Talk about that, please, because we don't hear from that side of the wall.
Well, you know, I know that there are people who commit murder and atrocities. I have to say I've been in prison, federal prison, 4 times, minimum security, maximum security. I don't know where they keep the bad sisters, because I've never, ever met a woman I would feel afraid of. And in fact, most of the guards this time around look like they
They have got to know you?
well, it's more of that they've gotten to know themselves and they don't think they have a cool job. I think they know they're working for a very broken system. But it's a system that dominates the lives of millions of people. By the time you add in all the people awaiting sentencing, all the people in prison, all the people on probation, you're talking about 7 million people. And I can't encourage strongly enough the new Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander and Just Mercies by Brian Stevenson, and ways that people can familiarize themselves with the realities that prisoners face these days. I mean, the prosecutor holds all the power in his hand in numerous cases, or her hand, because the prosecutor can threaten any narcotics defendant with the statistic that in 2012, for instance, somebody who pled guilty had an average of 5 years, 4 months as a sentence. If you pled not guilty, if you said, no, I'm taking this to court, I want to go before a jury of my peers, the average sentence was 16 years. So people plead guilty and they don't go to trial, and they think, well, this is better than what I might otherwise get if I tried to contest this, and whole neighborhoods get locked up.
That's really sad, and the way that system is. But you mentioned the system is broken. Did you mean the prison system,
Yes.
or the system, the American governance system, the capitalist system?
I was thinking of the prison system, although I think in many ways the empire is starting to collapse. But the prison system, I think, is very, very broken. In fact, in the building that I was housed in, the elevator didn't work, and there were people with health problems who needed an elevator, who shouldn't have been hauling themselves up and down staircases. The fire alarm system would go off at 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock, 3:30, 4 a.m. Nobody would pay any attention, except that it was annoying, and they didn't bother to fix that. The halfway house system is completely overloaded, so people are, ready to be released, and they can't go to a halfway house, so they can find themselves housing. The medical system is stressed to the max, and even in the men's prison, they actually put up posters begging male prisoners to take courses so that they can help with the geriatric care of elderly prisoners. The system for, in any way, equipping people to have a better life on the outside it was just nonsensical.
Let me ask you 2 more questions. I know you got to go sit in a panel discussion. Okay, one is, give us an example of the dialogue communication that took place between you and the group of women in prison.
Well, after the book that I had written about a previous
Which is what?
imprisonment called Other Lands Have Dreams was sent into the prison, some women started to read it. And I remember Tiza sitting next to me and saying, I can't believe it. I just can't believe that in 1988 you were writing about these conditions and it's only gotten worse. And other women would say to me, please stay in touch with us when you're gone. And 2 women had manufactured for me a crocheted bag with a kind of a heart embroidered on it. And they said, take this everywhere you go and take pictures and send us the pictures so we can stay in touch with what you're doing. It was this kind of goodwill, affectionate fondness that I saw everywhere in the prison. A great deal of compassion, a great deal of mercy, really. And if someone's child was sick, everybody in the prison would be kind of pulsating in a desire to protect that woman from loss or from despair. I joined the prison choir. I was a soprano, and it was quite wonderful to sing with the women, sonic harmony.
Nice. So I know none of us have the answers to the question that I'm going to ask you, but the collective us might be able to come up with a reasonable way for the future. And how do you see post-American Empire, or since the American Empire is in a really nosedive decline, how do we build a parallel society that replace this chaos?
I think we all can undertake now living the society we'd like to see. If you don't believe in killing people, don't kill anybody, don't pay for it, don't support it, don't tolerate it. If you believe that there should be a reduction in income inequities, then share your resources radically, share what you have, share your home, share your job, share your car. If you believe that it's a good idea for people to be of service, then drop out of any kind of dominance in terms of relationships that you might have access to and get involved in service. I think we have to be what we wish to be
As busy as we are, or imposed on us to be busy?
Yeah, and I think we have to really drop out of the sports and the entertainment and all of the things that get dangled as
You're
the
talking
things we're
about
supposed
drug. This is American drug, sports, entertainment.
Yeah, and I think we have to recognize that in some ways, very powerful elites want us to act like big children. And we just can't afford to be that way right now. We've got real children to take care of.
And talk about your scarf. We're going back to Afghanistan.
Well, the young people in Afghanistan make a scarf that says Bedune Mers.
Your Farsi is great.
Bedouin without, and Mers is written in one end, and then the other end says border free in English. And that's a little harder for the young women to stitch because it's not their language, border free. But they say there's one blue sky above us. And they look for that time when no one would kill another person on the basis of where a border is drawn or which politician has their hand in your pocket.
So the philosophical issue of societies without borders, even it's in Afghanistan, it's not just US and Western societies.
Oh, I think that it's very much in Afghanistan. I think that people are tired of war. And my young friends say to me, blood will not wash away blood.
Thank you, Kathy
Thank
Kelly.
you,
And
Mansoor.
I want you to give us a last word, please.
Well, I'll give you the verse that I learned. There's an army rising up. There's an army rising up to break every chain, break every chain. I hear those chains falling. I hear those chains falling. I hear those chains falling now.
Thank you.
Thank you.